On the national level, congressional Democrats may be falling behind their Republican counterparts in the polls, but it's a very different story here in Massachusetts, where all recent surveys have us poised for single-party rule, including a new Mass Inc. poll that shows Maura Healey up by a whopping 30 points on her Republican challenger for governor. Jeff Deal, Donald Trump's supporter, who at one point could be termed an election denier. Both are, of course, vying to replace Governor Charlie Baker, who it seems may have more in common with his likely Democratic successor than the head of his own party, which has shifted far to the right in the past several years under Mass GOP Chair Jim Lyons. The internal divisions have prompted the state's Republican committee to ask the federal Republican Party for help, writing to Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel late last month, asking her to use her office to intervene with Lyons and end his efforts to defeat our leading Republican candidate for statewide office. That candidate? Anthony Amore. He's the moderate Republican who, at 15 points behind his Democratic opponent for state auditor, Diana DiZoglio, is still the closest of any other Republican running for statewide office, and who the party seems hell-bent on undermining. Mind you, this is all happening to the party of the most popular governor in America, Republican Charlie Baker. Here to discuss what's going on and what it could mean for the people of Massachusetts are Republican State Senator Bruce Tarr, who served in the Massachusetts legislature for 31 years and has been serving as the Senate Minority Leader for the past decade, and Paul DeBole is a political science professor at Lasell University, former campaign aide to Republicans Lamar Alexander and John McCain. Paul and Senator, good to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be with both of you.
Paul, let me start with you. If the polls are right, it appears to me we're 19 days away for a total Republican blowout here in Massachusetts. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate.
Well, that was to the point. Senator, you're one of the, I believe it is 3 Republican senators, 28 Republicans in the House, which is still total, maybe 15% of the total legislature. The polls suggest that not one constitutional officer will end up being a Republican when we go to bed on November 8th. Is that the way you see it so far?
Well, what I think, Jim, is the only polls that count are the ones that are taken on Election Day. But
I've heard that before, by the way. I don't know if you know that, but go ahead.
I wouldn't be surprised, Jim, but certainly the numbers don't look good right now for Republican candidates, but that is something, again, that can change, and that's why the election runs all the way to November 8th and doesn't get executed in one day today.
Well, we all appear that that's the way things are trending. So staying with you, Senator, why is this happening? I think people viewing know what they're used to in the state for 24 of the last 32 years is a pretty strong Democratic legislature with a Republican governor sort of as a check. Why are we facing what we appear to be facing in 19 days?
Well, I don't know that I have a good answer for that, Jim, except to say that it is unfortunate that we do have some divisions, and it seems to me that if there was more unity among the candidates and among the party, then we could have been mounting stronger efforts. But that being said, I think there's still a good message being put forward by a number of Republican candidates, and I remain hopeful that it won't be as dismal as what we've been talking about.
What's that message that you find to be appealing to the average voter?
Well, you know, I think it's the message that you recited about the most popular governor in the United States of America, who came to the Beacon Hill to manage state government and not to engage in overly partisan, divisive rhetoric, but to talk about how we achieve solutions to the problems that people care about. And we've seen that play out, throughout his tenure. And I think there are certainly other Republicans who bring that to the table, who say every day what we need is common sense. We need to have fiscal discipline. I think that's a message that resonates with folks, particularly right now, when we see the impacts of inflation and rising energy costs. I think that's a message that is welcomed by a lot of the electorate.
Well, yeah, having said that, it bears noting that the only Republican candidate I'm aware that governor you're mentioning is endorsing out of all the Republicans is Anthony Amore for state auditor. Paul, why do you think the House is burning down on the Republican side? What happened here?
Well, we have a long history of divides within the Republican Party in Massachusetts. I know Bruce is may not remember this, but back in 1990, Stephen Pierce was the Republican nominee for governor and not Bill Weld.
At the convention, you mean, out of the convention?
Yes, out of the convention. So there's always been some, stronger conservative leanings by some portions of the party. But Republicans in Massachusetts, especially the successful ones, tend to be rather centrist in approach. And I think we're living in a political climate right now that's dominated by extremes from both sides.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You're both leaving out the one word that I think is the answer to my question, Paul, which is, well, two words: Donald Trump. I mean, the party itself is the Donald Trump party in a state that is not terribly fond of Donald Trump. Isn't that at the core of the problem here?
I think that's a major portion of the problem. But if you wanted to paint it with a broader brush, it's extremists on both sides of the political equation, whether it's extremely to the right or extremely to the left. And, you know, I think we have to get to a point where we can put those partisan divides aside.
Well, when you said, but Paul, if I may, you say extremists on both sides. The woman who, if the polls are right, is likely to be the next governor, has essentially run as Charlie Baker. With a couple of exceptions, she has not missed an opportunity to praise the performance of the outgoing governor. Am I not right?
And I think that's a major portion of her appeal. It's of her appeal. It's this centrist, common sense approach to government that's standing her well. And when you have extremists on both sides, that tends to detract from that message.
Yeah, you know, I woke up, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, Senator Tarr. I have problems with days. But I've known Jeff Deal for a long time, when he was a state rep ages ago. And I wake up either yesterday or today and I read a story where his latest social media ad talks about how we have to return Christian fundamental values to our schools. And I say to myself, it is not only fine, but for a lot of people appropriate to say things like, you know, Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, said about more parental power in schools and that kind of thing. But Christian fundamental values sounds like he's running for governor of Alabama, not governor of Massachusetts. What was your reaction to that?
Well, you know, I actually didn't see it, Jim, but I would suggest again that what we need to be talking about to be successful in Massachusetts is a centrist approach that you've already described, that's been embraced by the front runner in the gubernatorial race now, which Paul has described, about trying to solve the problems that people are facing in their daily lives and not getting into philosophical debates that don't necessarily advance the discussion that folks need to advance in order to be successful for public office.
Which of the two candidates, Senator Tarr, are you voting for, the Democrat or the Republican? I'm serious, by the way. No, I don't mean that as a joke. Who are you voting for?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that I'll be voting for the Republican, Jim. But, you know, again, I think that it's going to be something on Election Day that remains to be seen who prevails. But I think the candidates have a number of days to make their case.
Paul, why does it matter? I know this sounds almost like an embarrassing question to ask, but obviously the voters aren't asking themselves this question, or maybe the Republican Party isn't. Why does it matter that you have a two-party state? I assume people would say we had a Democratic governor for 8 years who was not exactly a radical, DeVal Patrick. Got along pretty well, or didn't do, I don't think, radical things. You've both described the Democratic nominee this round as centrist leading. So why does it matter that there are two vibrant parties in any state like Massachusetts?
You know, I think this might be more of a question of point of view than party affiliation. And I think to some extent those labels might be falling by the wayside as we move forward. There are people that are wedded to one political ideology that tends to be centrist. And again, I think the extreme people on both sides of the aisle, the extremists, take away from that centrist approach. But in Massachusetts, the one thing that, you know, absent the current structure of the Massachusetts party, is that a Massachusetts Republican is very, very different than a Republican in any other part of the country. And I would hazard to say that if you compared the stances on a number of issues between a Massachusetts Republican and a Southern Democrat, for example, the Southern Democrats would come a tad to the right of the Massachusetts Republicans. So I think the party, this party fixation that we have, we might see the beginnings of that cracking and falling down the wayside, where people are more wedded to a political approach rather than a party affiliation.
You know what? In general, I mean, if you're talking about a Charlie Baker, Massachusetts Republican, I agree with you. But you know, there are people like the woman who's running for Secretary of State here, who's talking about 4- and 5-year-olds having oral sex in school at the Republican convention. I mean, it's staggering. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think parties and voters need to do a better job.
Yeah, I do too.
Of vetting their candidates.
So does it matter? I mean, does it matter, Senator Tarr, as a Republican who's been a stalwart on Beacon Hill for a long time, if the Republican Party just comes apart at the seams after November 8th? And if it does matter, what's the path back to credibility?
So it does matter, Jim, and it matters a lot to have another voice in state government, and a voice that brings a different perspective and perhaps a different approach. And that our government depends on having different perspectives woven into the legislative and the governing processes. And so the path back is one where I think we have to evaluate the message and to make sure we have a message that resonates with the voters of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And again, after Election Day, there'll be a lot to think about.
Yeah, a lot of people I've spoken to in the last 24 hours about this say maybe one of the best things that could happen to the Republican Party is a total blowout, so they realize they got to rebuild the House. Paul, we only have about 30 seconds. You've worked for some people who understand the concept you're talking about, most notably John McCain. What would your advice be to Republicans who want to rebuild the party in Massachusetts?
Take a step back, focus on what we have in common, and weed out the extremes on both sides.
Fair enough. Paul DeBole, Senator Tarr, pleasure to see you both. Thanks so much for your time.
Great to see you. Thanks.
Good to see you, Bruce. Thank you, Jim.